Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on in 2020. And just briefly following up on last week's discussion with Patrick Bond about what he described as multipolarity versus antipolarity or nonpolarity in terms of thinking about the world, there was an interesting speech by Finland's President Alexander Stubb at the UN General Assembly this week. And we'll put the link to that in there where he poses it as multipolarity versus multilateralism. And he's talking about how all the countries of all the states of the world have agency and should be included. So that's what he means by multilateralism rather than multipolarity, where the few big powers decide through force what's going to go on in the world. So I thought that was an interesting follow-up. And Alexander Stubb is a kind of center-left politician in Finland. He's not a radical, but coming from a smaller country, the multipolarity talk from Putin and Xi and Trump doesn't use that language, but they're talking about carving up the world between them. He had a good comeback to that. So when you get a chance, read his speech. It's, I think, worth a read. So, as usual, let's start with Palestine. 90 people were killed by bombing last night, 84 the night before. There's no food or water coming into the people. They're starving. It's genocide. And one of the best speeches, I think, probably the best speech that I heard from the UN General Assembly this week was from the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro. And he called for military intervention to stop the genocide in Palestine, as we've talked about here before. And he apparently has a Uniting for Peace resolution for the UN General Assembly drafted, although no date has been set for its introduction. And the Uniting for Peace resolution, remember, that's where the UN General Assembly can get around the Security Council veto by getting a 2/3 vote for a resolution. And the resolution that Petro is purportedly introducing would require countries to enforce an arms embargo of Israel, strip Israel of its UN General Assembly credentials until the genocide stops, and authorize a UN protection force to deliver humanitarian aid, protect civilians, preserve evidence of war crimes, and facilitate reconstruction. So it's a long-term protection force. And we should be clear that this is different than what the French leading the EU and the Saudis leading the Arab League are proposing for a stabilization force, which would go in after a ceasefire was agreed to. And of course, Netanyahu wants to continue the war so he can stay in power. So that's an empty Uniting for Peace resolution. It's after a ceasefire, whereas the one that Colombia is proposing would send the UN in to stop the genocide now. And as I've said, I want to see the military feasibility of it. Petro talked about countries of the Middle East. He said the great Slavic peoples, and he might have said Latin America. Anyway, he wasn't counting on the U.S. But the military details, like I've said, you got these nuclear armed fanatics in Israel backed by the nuclear armed fanatics in the U.S. that this force would have to confront. And how do you do that militarily? That's a question. But nonetheless, it would be good if the UN passed that, and just keep your eye out on that. Meanwhile, Spain and Italy have sent naval vessels to protect the global Samud flotilla. That's about 50 vessels on their way to Gaza with humanitarian aid. And Israel has repeatedly attacked the flotilla with drones when they were docked in Tunisia. And along the way now they're just coming off Crete, which is part of Greece, got attacked again. But Spain and Italy have only said they'll rescue people who survive an Israeli attack, not directly engage the Israeli forces. But Spain's maritime action vessels that they're sending are armed with 76 millimeter rapid fire artillery cannon and 2 machine guns and a surveillance drone. So they could get into a confrontation with the Israelis. And, if Israel fires on a Spanish or Italian rescue boat, will they fire back? And if they do, or if they're fired on by Israel, will that, and their NATO countries, will that lead to Article 5 violation, where the NATO countries have pledged to defend each other? Attack on one is an attack on all, and would require collective NATO action against Israel. It'll be interesting to see. I don't think NATO is going to do that, but the question will come up. So there's a lot to watch right now in terms of what's going on with Palestine. Meanwhile, the so-called peace talks, Trump said they're just about to have an agreement. I think we can disregard that. Israel doesn't want an agreement. Hamas wants a complete ceasefire before they release all the hostages. So the war continues. And the other thing that happened with respect to Ukraine from Trump was he seems to have reversed himself. First of all, Trump gave an idiotically eye-rolling rant to the UN General Assembly on Tuesday with all the usual Trump self-promotion, whining about grievances, and probably the stupidest rejection of climate science you've ever heard. And then afterwards, he met with Zelensky and issued a surprising Truth Social post in which he said the Russian military is a paper tiger. They haven't been able to gain any ground in 3.5 years or much ground, and that Ukraine could win back all its lands with EU support. That's very different from what he said in February when he ambushed Zelensky in the Oval Office and said Ukraine had no cards to play. There's been reporting by military analysts that U.S. intelligence is giving Trump a different picture now, that Ukraine is actually being quite effective in undermining Russia's logistics behind the lines through its strikes on oil refineries and railroad tracks, and actually have been having some small counteroffensives and taking back land that the Russians had captured. So Trump said that, but he didn't change U.S. policy. He didn't offer military aid to Ukraine, although he did say willing to continue to sell arms to NATO. And he said they can do what they want with it. Of course, they're going to send it on to Ukraine. He didn't impose new sanctions on Russia. And in fact, implied it was up to Europe, India, and China to stop buying Russian oil and gas. And he's said that a couple times previously and said, we're not doing anything, the U.S. not doing anything to sanction Russia until Europe does. So no change there. And then he closed this somewhat long Truth Social post by saying, like he was refereeing a football match, in any event, I wish both countries well. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them. Good luck to all. So, he's basically looks like he's stepping back from trying to play a mediation role and going to watch them fight it out. And, if Ukraine can get the money or NATO can provide the money to buy weapons, they'll sell them. So that's, he's sort of washed his hands of the thing. He's frustrated that, he wanted a deal with Putin where they would carve up Ukraine between them and get back to doing oil and gas business, which is what the minerals deal that Trump forced on Ukraine was really about, more than rare earth minerals. There's gas under Ukraine and in the Black Sea, and there are those pipelines where U.S. businesses could get a piece of the action that transport Russian oil and gas across Ukraine into Europe. So, he wants to do business, but I think Putin wants to do business, but he doesn't want to stop the war because he thinks he's got the resources to completely defeat Ukraine. But, he thought he'd defeat Ukraine in 3 days when he first invaded in 2022, or did the first full-scale invasion. He's been in Ukraine, the Russians, since 2014. So one thing, let's put this graphic up. It's a background. It's a graphic of 100% clean energy in Ukraine by 2050 that the Solutions Project did. And that's Mark Jacobson and his team at Stanford University. It shows that Ukraine could go to 100% clean energy by 2050, and how they could do it, how many jobs it would create, how many lives it would save in terms of death from air pollution. You can go to the Solutions Project. They got one for Russia too. But Ukraine, and I post that because Ukraine is now facing another cold and dark winter, with Russia focusing attacks on Ukraine's energy power plants and transmission lines. And last year, Russia wiped out 9 gigawatts of Ukraine's power generation. That was half of the 18 gigawatts it had at the beginning of the year. It knocked out 8 thermal plants and 5 hydroelectric power plants, which prompted rolling blackouts across the country. And so they're down to 9 gigawatts. The pre-war capacity was 36 gigawatts, 4 times what it is now. And of course, Russia took a lot of that out by capturing the 6 nuclear reactors at Zaporizhia, which they still hold, but they're not operating. And in fact, for 3 days now, I haven't checked the news today, the external power source to the nuke, and nukes need external power to run their cooling systems and so forth, that's been cut off. The transmission line's been cut off. It's not clear how that happened, but right now those Zaporizhia nukes are running on diesel generators as backup, and they only have enough diesel for 20 days. So once again, there's a crisis developing at Zaporizhia. And, you know, part of the reason for the crisis, even in the absence of this cutoff of external power, is that Russia has been committing massive war crimes against the staff and families of the Ukrainians that operated the Zaporizhia nuclear power plants that it captured early in the war. And we'll put this link in. The title is Russia's Rosatom, that's their nuclear corporation, state corporation, complicit in war crimes, report alleges, says treatment of power plant staff risks nuclear disaster. And you can read that. I mean, they have something like 10 of those staff have been killed in detention, apparently from torture and beatings. Hundreds of the family have also been caught up in this thing. There are 10 staff that are just missing. It's, you know, so this is a war crimes report that was done by Greenpeace Ukraine and a group called Truth Hounds. And you can look at the Kyiv Independent. You can get a link there to the full report, which is like 150 pages. Now, Ukraine is building renewable energy capacity, and it should total about 0.4 of a gigawatt by the end of this year, which would be about 5% of their power. That's where they got to go. Distributed wind and solar is a lot harder to take out than centralized thermal plants. But in the meantime, Ukraine faces a cold and dark winter, and its air defenses are depleted. And while the U.S. has agreed to sell Patriot air systems that Europe bought for Ukraine, they're slow walking it. So there's another article we'll put in there also from the Kyiv Independent. Ukraine braces for renewed blackouts amid a new wave of Russian attacks on energy, which, you know, describes how Russia's been, you know, and they're sending over hundreds of drones and, you know, a couple dozen missiles just about every night into Ukraine. And it's taken out, you know, the energy infrastructure. They're going after the rail system now, as well as just terrorism toward residential buildings, schools, and hospitals. So, you know, I mentioned that the so-called minerals deal was more about oil and gas and pipelines than rare earth minerals. And at the Trump-Putin summit, they talked as much about oil and gas as a peace deal. And Antonia Juhas has been writing about that at Rolling Stone. I put links in previous to her articles in previous podcasts. But if you want to know more about that, that is good information from her. So I think the situation is Trump's willing to cut business deals with Russia despite the war, which only helps Russia. And in fact, there was negotiations leading up to it. Exxon started lobbying Russia to get back into Russia to do the oil and gas business as soon as Trump was inaugurated. And then on the day of the Alaska summit, Putin issued a decree opening up Russia to Exxon and other foreign energy giants. And I think that's why Zelensky, in his speech at the United Nations this week, he castigated the failure of the UN, and not so harshly, but it was there, Ukraine's allies, like the US under Biden and the European countries, who have not supported Ukraine enough to stop Russia's aggression. And he basically said the only security guarantees that Ukraine can count on are its own armed forces and weapons production, which they've really ramped up. And now they're even talking about exporting arms. It's, Russia's war on Ukraine has basically led to a militarization and a pretty effective military-industrial complex in Ukraine. So this situation was the topic of a panel discussion that I chaired, sponsored by the Ukraine Solidarity Network and hosted by Haymarket Books on Tuesday night. It was called Ukraine in the Crosshairs of the Superpowers. And the speakers were Tanya Vyhovsky, who we've had on this podcast. She's a Ukrainian American, a member of the Vermont Progressive Party and the Democratic Socialists of America. She's a state senator in Vermont, and she just got back from a trip to Ukraine. And then Ilya Butsratskas, who we've also had on this program. He's an exiled anti-war Russian socialist. And then Dennis Bondar, another person we've had on this program. He's a Ukrainian physicist at Tulane University and a member of the Ukraine Solidarity Network. So that panel is now up on YouTube, and we'll put the link to that in the chat. And that'll give you some more perspective on what's going on right now. But it's a fluid situation. And Russia just announced that they are stopping all exports of oil until the end of the year because Ukraine has been really hitting their refineries and their export ports hard. And Russia's now having shortages not only for their military, but for their domestic market. And they got gas lines even in Moscow and St. Petersburg, let alone Crimea is really hit hard. So I guess the last thing I'll say about that is people have been saying from the beginning of the war that it's hopeless for Ukraine. They should surrender and cut a deal now before they lose more land. And the fact is Ukraine has fought them off. And, if you talk to the Ukrainians, they'll tell you, we don't have any choice. Because to be under occupation from Russia is like being bombed. The repression and the destruction of their civil and political rights is just unacceptable. So the other big news this week was Jimmy Kimmel getting suspended by ABC and the stations that own ABC affiliates, particularly Sinclair and Nexstar. And there was a big public outrage, and ABC relented, and then Sinclair and Nexstar did. I mentioned this last week, I want to talk about media reform. The Greens need a media reform platform, given the growing monopolization of media outlets and the Trump regime's use of state power to censor content. That's what the Jimmy Kimmel suspension was all about. He made some comments about Charlie Kirk and, made fun of Trump. And he just played a video of Trump, who was asked about, how bad he felt about Charlie Kirk being killed. And he gave one line on that. And then he started talking about the trucks are coming to, build the new ballroom for the White House. It just seemed, pretty callous. And for making fun of Trump, the head of the Federal Communications Commission, Brendan Carr, complained and said it could lead to regulatory retaliation against ABC. So then ABC suspended him. And the reason the FCC has leverage over ABC is that Disney, the owner of ABC, and owners of its affiliated stations, they could face potential revocation of their broadcast licenses from the FCC. So, that's the leverage they had, and so people were saying it's censorship, and it highlights how, with the monopolization of the media industry and the government intervening into what people say, we're leading to a very censored media system. And the media oligarchs are they're right wingers. Think of Fox News, Newsmax, One America, Sinclair, Clear Channel, all very hard right. And to give a sense of how concentrated the media has become, there's a graphic that I remember this from 2011, and we'll put it up as a link. And it showed that in 1983, 90% of the media in the U.S. was controlled by 50 companies. And this graphic says by 2011, 90% was controlled by just 6 companies. And today there's a lot of stuff going on on Twitter, and Ali Velshi just said it on MSNBC that it's just 5 companies that control 90%. I looked into that. I couldn't find any serious studies of that. But when we say media, we're including news, entertainment, publishing, book publishing, magazine publishing, music, internet, you name it. So there's another graphic. The 2011 graphic. There's another graphic from the Motley Fool, which is more recent. It was updated August 22nd, 2025. And it identifies, like the 2011 study did, the 6 big media companies, although they've changed because of mergers. So the big 6 now are Comcast, Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, Paramount Skydance, which was a recent merger, Sony, and Amazon. Amazon was not just getting into the media business back in 2011. So, here's some of the developments that have been going on. Nexstar and Tegna want to merge. And if they do, it'll be the largest TV company by far in the U.S., reaching 80% of all U.S. households, which is way behind the current FCC regulatory limit of 39% by one company. And of course, it was FCC Chair Brendan Carr that threatened regulatory action against ABC, which led to Jimmy Kimmel's suspension. And Nexstar owns many ABC affiliate stations. So when Brendan Carr says he's, threatening regulatory action, the Nexstar-Tegna merger becomes, something that he has influence over. And Nexstar and Sinclair together own 70 ABC stations, which means most of the country. So at first, Jimmy Kimmel was off the air, or when he was restated to the air, ABC reinstated him, but the Nexstar and Sinclair stations hesitated. Now they've done it, which for one thing shows the power of public protest, but on the other hand, it shows the power of these media oligarchs. Just another development, Larry Ellison, big Wall Street, he's a software billionaire, tech billionaire, owns Oracle, and his son, David Ellison. Ellison has been the first or second richest man in the world recently, along with Elon Musk. For a while, Ellison got ahead of Musk. He owns Paramount. And when Paramount wanted to merge with Skydance, CBS was sued by Trump, and it was frivolous. He had some complaint about 60 Minutes not airing the full interview with the Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris, and CBS settled for $16 million. They basically paid a bribe so they could get this Paramount Skydance merger, which has now happened. And that gave Ellison also control of CBS. And then CBS, in this process, before the merger was approved, they canceled Trump critic, comedian Stephen Colbert's show, which is going to be phased out, I guess, next May. So again, the tech billionaires or the media billionaires, the Wall Street billionaires are buying up the media, and the government extracts favors from them, and it really amounts to censorship. So now the Ellison family wants to merge with Warner Brothers, one of those 6 big companies, which owns CNN. And if that happens, the Ellisons will control streaming services, that's, I guess, your cable, with a combined 200 million plus subscribers, big portion of the public. And now TikTok is going to be owned by the Ellisons and the Murdochs, Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, and some reactionary Emirati oligarchs from the Middle East, and some private equity billionaires here in the US. And that raises a question of surveillance. Oracle has worked with both the US and Chinese authorities to analyze data from millions of surveillance cameras in both countries. And so this will just give, with TikTok, which was the big concern, the Chinese communists were surveilling us. Now it's going to be Ellison, the oligarchs. It's just, these are just more examples of the concentration continues. And newspapers canceled endorsements of Kamala Harris to help Trump. Remember that in the election? The Amazon oligarch Jeff Bezos told the Washington Post to can its endorsement of Harris. And the big pharma oligarch Patrick Soon-Shiong, who owns the Los Angeles Times, did the same thing. And then, of course, Elon Musk bought Twitter. So it goes on. And the media is being concentrated more and more in the hands of oligarchs who are dependent on the good graces of a right-wing government under Trump. It's a very dangerous situation for a public sphere where information can be, and opinion can be freely debated. And the roots of this problem go back to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, where President Bill Clinton, working hand in hand with Republican House Speaker Newt Gingrich, pushed the law, the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which was a major corrupt piece of legislation largely written by corporate lobbyists from the media companies and hardly debated in Congress. It passed the US Senate 81-18. Now, prior to that 1996 law, a media company could only own a maximum of 12 TV stations nationwide. Now you have groups like both Nexstar and Sinclair, right-wing networks, each own over 200 stations. And then the conservative radio company, Clear Channel, it owned about 50 radio stations in 1996. Now it owns 1,200. And there was a rule that was overturned in that law. There used to be a rule that was established in 1975 when the Congress at that time was concerned about media conglomeration. They had a rule against cross ownership of newspapers and broadcast companies in the same market. And the 1996 law got rid of that too. So that 1996 law is one of the worst legacies of the Clinton administration, which the Trump administration is now taking advantage of. So let me wrap up with some suggestions about things we should put in a platform for a free, diverse, and uncensored media. And the first thing would be to repeal and replace the Pro-Conglomeration Telecommunications Act of 1996. And in that act, we could have things, or they could be passed by separate acts. We should have a guarantee of free universal internet access through a public internet infrastructure. The costs of internet access in this country are off the charts compared to other countries like, say, South Korea. We're paying extra just so these oligarchs can line their pockets. We need to continue the fight for net neutrality. We got it from the FCC during the Biden years, but then in a January 2025 decision by the Sixth Circuit Court, it ruled that internet companies cannot be regulated by federal government like utilities, although they obviously are utilities. That ruling did not overturn state regulations, so some of those are still in effect. But it's really up to Congress to legislate net neutrality in a way that the right-wing courts cannot overturn it. So there's a plank, Green candidates for Congress can run on. We need to advocate and fight for antitrust actions to break these media conglomerates up, because their concentrated power not only threatens competitive pricing, it threatens democracy. We should require separate independent firms for all TV stations, TV networks, TV show producers, radio stations, newspapers, magazines, book publishers, film producers, music recorders, internet service providers, cable TV systems, amusement parks, and so forth. And that diverse ownership will enable more points of view to be broadcast. But in order to do that in today's market, we need to support nonprofit and non-commercial media. So we need a decentralized democratic system of public funding that will subsidize these nonprofit and non-commercial media. And it should include broadcast, print, film, website, and other cultural production. And the public board should be selected by sortition, by lottery, not by elections that wealthy special interests can buy and influence. And those boards will then reflect the public that's out there, so that all points of view will get their say. We need to restore public broadcasting, which now Trump is, pulling the funding from, and already the funding was limited. So public radio was heavily reliant on corporate advertising. It needs to get back to real public radio and television with no advertising or grants from private corporations and foundations. It needs to be a decentralized, pluralistic system with multiple public TV, radio, and news publications, all independently controlled by boards, for each station that are selected from the public by sortition. Now, sortition, not everybody wants to serve, so that has to be one criteria because it is work. But of those interested, select them at random, and we'll get boards that reflect what's out there in the public, not what special interest could buy in an election, or a self-perpetuating board could, steer one way or another. The public airwaves, those are public property, and we need to reassert the public's right as owners of the electromagnetic spectrum. So to use the public airwaves, these broadcasters have to meet certain criteria. Also, we need to deconcentrate who has access to those airwaves. So we need to redistribute substantial bandwidth concessions to public, nonprofit, and locally owned commercial stations, including low power stations. We need to do what was done before the Telecommunications Act, and that is public broadcasters, who are using the public airwaves had to provide 6 primetime hours a day of commercial broadcast time on each station for real public service broadcasting. I said prime time. I meant just 6 hours a day of ad-free children's and news and public affairs programming. And we could help fund this liberated time by charging commercial broadcasters rents for the use of their part of the radio, the electromagnetic spectrum, a tax on sales of commercial stations, a tax on advertising. There are various ways of funding that. And the ad-free time should be under the control of the artists and educators for the children's programs and journalists for the news and public affairs programs. So it's not coming top down from ownership. We need to restore the fairness doctrine. That used to require, before it was repealed, that holders of broadcast licenses present controversial issues of public importance in a way that fairly reflects differing viewpoints. That's obviously not happening in today's, particularly the right wing, but also, the MSDNC, as it's called. It's so that's what the fairness doctrine was about. It's different from the equal time rule, which is actually still in effect. And that only applies to political candidates, but all candidates are supposed to have equal time. And actually, at Ralph Nader's urging, I tried to get equal time rule enforced against Rush Limbaugh, who had Trump on for a 3-hour campaign rally on one of his radio programs in 2020. So I complained to the FEC. I never got an answer. I sent a release to the media. They didn't cover my complaint. And I was working at suing the FCC, but my pro bono lawyer was too slow, and then Limbaugh died, making the case moot. So even getting the equal time rule applied takes work, but that's what we got to do. And then finally, related to campaigns also, airwaves, part of the public property, the electromagnetic spectrum, those broadcasters should provide free time for all candidates for public office, for all ballot qualified candidates. They should be included in broadcast debates on public airwaves. And by that, I mean not just publicly owned, but that are on the electromagnetic spectrum. And we should prohibit paid political ads and instead require equal free time for ads that candidates can put up and level the playing field. So, Greens should campaign for a media program like that. We don't have much in the Green national platform. And, if you go read it, it seems dated, like about 2 decades out of date. And then, God, I could talk about a lot more. I've been going too long. The government's about to shut down in 3 days. I won't talk about that now. It may be the big topic when we meet next week. So what do you think? Looking forward to your questions and comments. Vicky Corden, I wonder if they will try to censor media from overseas. I stream news from overseas because U.S. news does not always tell the whole story. Yeah, Vicky, it doesn't tell any story. I mean, when I go to cable to find out what's going on, I go to BBC, which in my Spectrum cable is the only international source where I get news about what's going on in the rest of the world. What I get from MSNBC or CNN or Fox or a few other partisan, like there's an Israeli station on the cable, and I can't remember what else, but none of them are News Nation. None of them really cover what's going on internationally. So, you can't get Al Jazeera on a lot of cable systems. I can't on mine. That is a pretty good source if you keep in mind that I think Qatar runs it, and they won't run news that's against Qatar's interests, but they do good reporting on stuff around the world. I look them up on the internet all the time. RT used to be on our programs. Now RT is a Russian propaganda outlet. It's terrible. It spreads conspiracy theories and a lot of right-wing nonsense. And, but it got censored. And I think, what we should be, you can get RT if you go on the internet. People should be media savvy. We need, as part of our civics education, how to read the news and not be bamboozled by propagandists. That should be all part of our education rather than, preemptive censorship. On the internet right now, you can pretty much find everything in this country. A lot of countries, block it. Russia does that, China does that, Iran does it. It's a lot of countries block news. Israel won't let reporters into Gaza. There's just a lot of censorship going on. So I was talking about cable. Can they censor the internet? Apparently they do it in China and Russia. So that may be something to watch. I'm not aware of it happening now by any of our major internet providers. But they say the algorithms are biased. I mean, that's another thing. Those should be transparent. And so we know if they are biasing, when you do a search with a search engine, whether you're being excluded from certain points of view. That's what, that's why I said we should have a public internet system with net neutrality. So that's the best I can tell you, Vicki. I think it's something we need to keep an eye out for and, fight to open up the information ecosystem. A. Jones 35. Everything but the fairness doctrine. Government should not be governing content. Air America Radio failed not because of lack of knowledge, because they were lousy broadcasters. Yeah, and the investors in Air America, the liberal oligarchs, were just, this is what I've read, analyses of it. They were not in it for the cause. They were in it to make money. Whereas the right-wing oligarchs have supported, the Rush Limbaugh show and everything that came after it, going back to the 80s. They just kept pouring money in because they were down for the cause. They didn't see that as a big source of profit. So the liberal capitalists have less commitment to their point of view than the reactionary capitalists. That's one thing I think explains why Air America couldn't sustain itself. Yeah, and I think their broadcasters, there were some good ones, but some were not so good. I think Tom Hartman's pretty good. Some of the others, I can't even remember their names. They were so lousy. So now the fairness doctrine, I think is a standard. So if you feel a broadcaster is excluding your point of view, you can go to the FCC and get a hearing. I don't have a problem with that. I think there has to be some kind of forum. But anyway, that's my opinion. The fairness doctrine, under a Trump administration wouldn't be administered fairly, granted. So it's one of those things where you just can't let your guard down, and you got to keep advocating that your point of view gets a hearing. Scout Trooper 164, any thoughts on Russia threatening U.S. airspace? I feel like Russia is trying to get someone to respond since they know they're losing against Ukraine and want justification to launch nukes. I don't think Putin wants a nuclear war. He wants to, as that leaked, maybe it was deliberately leaked, conversation between him and Xi about living past 100 and organ transplants and living to 150. I don't think Putin is suicidal. So I don't think he wants a nuclear war. I think what they're doing is testing, how NATO and the U.S. respond. Now, what the Russians did, they went into a kind of warning zone. It's not U.S. air. It's outside of that, but it's near U.S. airspace. So our jets then go intercept. That means watch them and escort them out of that closer area. That's been going on a lot, not just in recent days. It got attention in recent days because Russia sent something like 24 drones into Poland, another one into Romania. They flew 3 jets over Estonia. And then there's some mysterious drones that have been harassing Danish airports that people wonder if one of those Russian oil tankers was launching them because the tanker was making unusual moves as it went near Denmark on the way out of the Baltic Sea toward the Atlantic. So I think that's why that provocation or close air flights by the Russians caught so much attention. It's been going on for a while. And I think what Russia's doing is just testing, how NATO and the U.S. respond. So it's definitely something to be concerned about and keep an eye on. The Green Garrett. Any thoughts on Trump announcing he's ordering the War Department to occupy Poland and use full force. Yeah, my first thought was, okay, there's a lot of anarchists in Portland who want to fight, black bloc types. And Trump may be looking, to provoke a fight to justify more use of force in cities. That's my first thought on that. I don't know what particular incidents or events in Portland he said prompted sending troops in there. There's stuff going on all over. It's going on all over Syracuse, where I am. Now, we haven't had a violent response. We've had protests for sure. We've had violence from ICE and Border Patrol. And just, the worst sort of, detention of people because they look Latino. Some of them are citizens. Some of them have work permits. And a lot of them have just been detained and disappeared, breaking up families, leaving a lot of children without mothers or fathers. Pregnant women or women who recently had birth, not being able to nurse their babies. It's terrible. It's just cruelty. And so anyway, I don't know what particularly I haven't seen what he said about why he's going to Portland. But Portland, Oregon, the first Trump administration sent a big contingent of ICE and Border Patrol in there. And there was some confrontation. So I think he's looking for a confrontation in order to justify more militarization of the deportation process. Cole McMillan. Howie, any thoughts on the recent most favored nation prescription drug pricing executive order? Trump administration's attempt to lower drug prices. It almost seems like an indirect endorsement of the Inflation Reduction Act's strategy, which allowed Medicare Part B and D to directly negotiate drug prices for 10 selected drugs. Only maybe Republicans are trying to cut Medicare out of the equation. I'm not up on the recent act. I heard a little bit about it. If you go to the first part of the question again, that was referencing most favored nation prescription pricing executive order. I just sort of heard a headline on the news, but I haven't followed the details. In terms of the 10 drugs that they're supposed to negotiate lower prices on, my understanding is that is stopped, and they're really not negotiating anymore. So these prices are not coming down. So that's something I got to look into, Cole. I haven't got the details on that enough to say much. Scout Trooper 164, any thoughts on Italy deciding not to give Israel any more weapons? Feels stupid as hell for how late it is. Feels stupid as hell. Well, I'll take progress where we get it. European countries are starting to get really fed up with Israel. They've given it a lot of slack over the years, diplomatic cover for how it's treated the Palestinians. And now that it's streaming live every day, they're deciding, we gotta stop Israel. So, my thought is, when is the U.S. going to do that? What do we have? 23? What did it get up to 23 senators when Sanders brought that forward again? About half the Democratic caucus in the Senate. So it's about, say, a quarter of the Senate. We don't have a good vote in the House. There is this bill to block offensive arms to Israel that, to get it to the floor, they're going to need a discharge petition. I haven't heard anything about that. But it's something we should be pushing our House representatives to push. So at least we get them on the record. So next year, as we go into the midterms, we know their position on the issue and we can hold them to account. So, it feels stupid as hell for how late it is for the U.S. It's just a moral embarrassment. And, the fact that the so-called opposition party, the Democrats, can't make hay of this issue when the polls show that Americans want to cut the arms off. They are sick of this war. They know it's wrong. And the Democrats seem more beholden to, they're afraid of AIPAC and some of the pro-Zionist campaign donors than they are of their own constituents. It's morally bankrupt. That's why we need a Green Party. We need our own candidates out there that, fight for what's right, not for what'll get them money. Vicky Corden, Trump is doing similar things that Viktor Orban did to the media in Hungary. Yeah, I don't know the details of what Orban did. I know that he's done things to the electoral system that's made it easier to stay in power. I also know that the polls show he could lose next year in the elections, and his party could be displaced, which would be a good thing. I think Hungarians think Orban's took it too far. But I don't know the details of media control in Hungary. But, Orban's very popular with the far right in our country. Tucker Carlson did an interview with him, and like he did with Putin, and, was very positive toward him. It's that, friendliness toward right-wing authoritarians with so-called traditional values. That's why the right here likes Putin and Orban. Anthony, was a time when the Rose Orders used to entertainment performance to teach and influence illiterate masses. That gets into weird esoterics, but I wonder if they influence the Democratic Socialists of America. Okay, when the Rose Orders, I'm not sure what that's referring to. Maybe the Rose Orders, you mean the socialists? The rose is the symbol of the Socialist Party. I think it's also a symbol of DSA. But it's true, the socialist movement had a strong cultural component. Certainly the Second International lead up into World War I, they had, they owned a lot of property for, various cultural things, from, choirs to athletics and publishing houses. But I'm not sure what you're referring to, the weird esoterics. Yeah, I if I'm supposed to know what the Rose Orders are, I don't. So I'm not sure what else to say. Although I will say DSA, traditionally, Michael Harrington is its leader. Just to give you some background, the American Socialist Party of Eugene Debs and Norman Thomas split three ways in 1972 over the war in Vietnam. The right-wing Social Democrats USA basically went to work for the CIA, and their leaders became, top officials in the government or propagandists working with the CIA. The middle group was the what became Democratic Socialists of America, Michael Harrington, and his group couldn't make up its mind on Vietnam. They kind of had a campus view that the West was less evil than the East in terms of political rights. So they aligned with the US and they thought they were fighting for that in Vietnam, which is, kind of ridiculous if you look in retrospect. And then the left wing, which is today's Socialist Party USA, who gave me their nomination in 2020, they were the anti-war and those socialists who wanted to stay independent of the Democratic Party. Harrington represented those like the Social Democrats USA that wanted to become a faction within the Democratic Party. So that's how we get to DSA today. And I think DSA thinks it's influencing the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party is influencing it. Because in order to be part of the Democratic Party, they have to agree to certain things. I mean, the best example is Bernie Sanders, who wasn't a DSA member, but he was an independent, a small d, Democratic Socialist, small s. But in order to run the Democratic primary in 2016, he had to agree to support whoever won the primaries, which everybody, when he started running, thought would be Hillary Clinton, and himself too. And if he hadn't have done that, he would not have got onto Democratic primary ballots. He would not have been included in the Democratic primary debates. So that's one way they grab you. I know that Zohran Mamdani, his campaign, in consultation with Working Families Party and DSA in New York, decided at the beginning if they lost the primary to Cuomo, they wouldn't challenge him on the Working Families line. And then they reaffirmed that decision as he rose in the polls and it looked like he might win. They're basically saying if Cuomo wins, we'll back him, or at least we won't run against him. And that's more loyalty to the Democratic Party than Cuomo himself had, who set up an independent line in case he lost, and he's now using it to run again. More loyalty than Eric Adams, the mayor, who just said, I can't win the Democratic primary, I'm going to run. And he's got two independent lines. Mamdani showed more loyalty to the Democrats than those guys did. And they're, establishment Democrats. So that's maybe not answering your question, Anthony, but when you bring up Democratic Socialists with capital letters, I think of DSA. And I know they're influenced by the Democratic Party because they so much want to be a player inside it. And instead of changing the Democrats change them. Vicky Corden, any thoughts about James Comey being arrested? Has he been arrested? I think he's just been, he's got a grand jury indictment pending. And they could arrest anyone who disagrees with the regime. Yeah, that's where it's headed. And, listening a little bit on radio, a lot of lawyers say that the judge will probably throw this out because it's so baseless. But being harassed like that, I mean, Comey's daughter had to quit the Department of Justice. I think his son-in-law just quit, embarrassed by this indictment of Comey. I mean, it's so ironic because when Comey, not following normal rules of the FBI, said a couple of weeks before the election that they were re-examining Hillary Clinton and what was it about Clinton? The emails or the server she had in her house because new information had come up. And then like a week later, he said, nope, nothing there. We're closing that investigation. But that really hurt Clinton and helped Trump. It's so ironic after doing that, whether Comey intended to or not, Trump is going after him because Comey would not pledge allegiance as director of the FBI. It does indicate that, the Trump regime will go after anyone who disagrees with them. And they'll try to weaponize the Justice Department to do it, even if the laws and the evidence don't back up their claims. Just being harassed and having to hire a lawyer and go through that whole process is harassment. And it's a deterrent on people speaking out who just don't want to face that trouble. So, yeah, it's very repressive. And I saw a graphic on MSNBC this morning. There's a whole lot of people that are apparently on Trump's hit list, including Barack Obama. It's like a political purge. And, the funny thing is, on the left, we worry about repression. I mean, Trump wants to take out the Democratic Party, which is so much part of the establishment. So anyway, yeah, it's not good. Anthony, probably along the lines of the Rosicrucians. Okay, Anthony, I got to do some research because I'll write that down. I don't know what you're talking about. Maybe I am just not up on something I should be. Scout Trooper. Also, tomorrow is my 26th birthday. Well, happy birthday, Scout Trooper. Okay, there's the banner signaling our hour is up. Sorry I took so long to go through those things, but there was a lot of news, with the UN General Assembly meeting and what's going on in Palestine and Ukraine, and then with Jimmy Kimmel, this media situation. I was somewhat disappointed that, and I hadn't looked. The Green Party platform is pretty weak on media policy, and it's obviously an important thing because the oligopolization and the oligarchs owning our media and what they do, particularly with the right-wing government in there that's weaponizing Justice Department against anybody who criticizes the government. It's a dire situation, and we should. And I took some time to lay out a whole laundry list. A campaign that's got to, break that down into, media friendly slogans and sound bites, and then you can elaborate from there. So, so next week I don't have a guest planned. We may have a government shutdown, which will give us, something to talk about. A lot of us depend on government services, from the VA to, Social Security and Medicare. Now, some of this stuff is supposed to continue. I expect my Social Security check. Well, I get it on about the 10th of the month. I'll be really pissed if it doesn't come because my budget depends on it. And I'm sure most of you have, something that you expect a government service to provide. And if it's not, you're going to be pissed off. So let's see how pissed off we are next week about that. Right now, all the signs are there is going to be a shutdown. And, the big talk will be who to blame. But meanwhile, we'll all be out of luck. So, and then, there's so much other news going on. We'll have plenty to talk about. So everybody have a good week. And like I've been saying, stay active, work with other people. It's going to make you feel a lot better than just reading what's coming across on your screens. And what we do makes a difference. Look at the Jimmy Kimmel backlash and how it got result from this big media company. So, keep the faith and keep active. Have a good week.